We're up here in Muston Creek, which is the top, pretty close to the top of this system, but it's sort of the midway between the coast and the Great Dividing Range. Muston Creek flows into Muston's Creek, which then flows into the Hopkins River. Hopkins River obviously flows down towards Warrnambool, but the important thing is it then drops over the Warrnambool Falls, and I'll come back to that, but just keep in mind there's a huge set of waterfalls right at the bottom of this system. Obviously it's really wet at the moment, but a lot of southwestern Victoria has been dry for quite a while, and we did a project a while ago and it was centred more on in normal streams, so regulated streams like you know, the Glenelg, for instance. You've got Hopkins Reservoir up the top, it stores water. We've got the ability to release some of that water as environmental flow during dry times of the year. So, you know, we can freshen pools, we can sustain fish populations, but that's in the larger rivers. And something people tend to have forgotten is that not all species of fish are found in those big systems. Often there can be very few fish in those systems except for large predatory fish. A lot of our species diversity of fish can often be in some of these side tributaries in midland to upland areas. So coming from a drought perspective, how are we looking after the aquatic fauna in those areas? Well, there's no way to provide additional water because they're not regulated. So if a system dries up, what can we do? And so we wanted to see, can we predict where there might be refuge pools across the landscape? So these are refuge pools that could survive over a dry period, still retain some water of sufficient quality that might let some of these fish survive, so that when we get a situation like this where you get good rains again, water flows back, you know, these fish can have bred and then they can redistribute and therefore sustain themselves in the catchment. And what we found was that in this volcanic area there are a number of areas where you do get spring flows coming up, or groundwater expression at the surface, and they're really important areas for providing not only water but also, I guess, cool water during those dry periods. And remember I said there's two types of fish. You've got the migratory ones and the non-migratory ones. So it's great if migratory ones end up in these pools, they'll survive, but remember you've also got all the juveniles coming up every year.
Bit the fish.
The trouble comes where you get something like a river blackfish. It's non-migratory, it can't come in from anywhere else, it's long-living, it doesn't produce that many young. So in a catchment, if it dries out and there's no refuge pools, these things can become extinct, and then you've got very little ability for them to naturally recolonise back. So fantastically, we're sitting on a property here that has a really good spring system, and obviously you can see the benefits of that because you've got the river blackfish here. What you might be thinking in your head is, so why is this area important? Well, this river blackfish, there's in the whole Hopkins and Portland Coast Basin, there are only 3 known populations left. We know from historical literature and also from old newspaper articles that they were once a lot more widespread. And they've just slowly disappeared over time. Probably partly from overfishing, because remember before I said if you pull out some of the big ones, you know, your smaller ones don't reproduce as well and the populations can go down quickly. But I suspect there's also a drought issue there as well. So here is one key population in the Hopkins. The other one is down near the Hopkins and the Lower Emu. There's a small number of river blackfish still surviving in that area, and that's another area that still has flows coming in from the Mount Emu. And there may be other areas of the catchment as well. So identifying where some of these areas across the landscape is important for, if we're just thinking aquatics and we're just thinking fish, in terms of working out how we can sustain these. Then the next question is, once you've identified where these locations are, how can they be managed in a really balanced way so that all the needs of the community as well as the fish are met? And in some respects it's not that hard. Bobby's done a fantastic job. You have a look, you know, the amount of, there's very little erosion along the banks, and that's exemplified by the fact that you've still got all these rocks in the river and all those gaps and spaces for the fauna to push into. You know, that's a fantastic outcome. And that's the first step, because river blackfish really suffer if there's a lot of sediment. Remember, they lay their eggs on a hard substrate. You get too much sediment, the male gets lazy and goes, I can't do this anymore, and takes off, and those eggs die. Or the eggs just get blanketed anyway, despite his efforts, by too much sediment. So that's another real key that can knock out river blackfish. So their presence here is indicative of really good habitat plus a drought refuge.